Hey guys, Metal Jesus here, and today we are going to take a look at something kinda different. You saw the thumbnail and you were probably just like me going, what the heck is this? Well, I was sent this prototype. It's called the OneXSugar, and this is a gaming handheld that is kind of unlike anything that I have ever personally seen, and it does some really cool stuff. I've had this thing for a couple weeks now, been playing a bunch of stuff on it, so I want to give you my thoughts in this video and kind of show you what this thing is all about. Now, if you've been paying attention to this market before, you know that there's a lot of these cheaper, or I should say inexpensive, Chinese emulation handhelds on the market, right? There's a bunch of companies that make these. They sell them all over the internet and on Amazon, where they are more traditionally designed, right? They're usually like, they look kind of like a Switch or maybe a PSP, but then others kind of look more like a Game Boy or Game Boy Advance. Well, this is something much different than that because it wants to be all things to all people, and I have to say, for the most part, it definitely succeeds. However, it's also complicated, and we're gonna go all through that. It actually took me several days of just kind of scratching my head going, okay, how do I do this, and how is this working? But in the end, actually, I think they've hit upon something kind of wild, and way better than I actually expected it to be. So what is this thing? Well, to start off with, it is an Android 14 device. So it runs Android 14, which means that just like your cell phone, it can run pretty much a ton of different Android apps and games, including emulators. And so that's pretty much what most people are going to be using this for, is running ROMs. And by the way, every game that I show running in this video, I own a physical version of it personally. In its default configuration, it's got a fairly decently sized display. So it's got a 6-inch OLED display running a resolution of 2160 by 1080. I want to give you a couple size comparisons. So here it is next to the Steam Deck, and you can see that the screen is almost as large as the regular Steam Deck, but obviously the Steam Deck is, you know, a little bit wider as well. And then here it is next to a PSP, which this also runs. It runs PSP games, and so you can see it's definitely much larger than a PSP screen. And then here it is next to the 3DS XL. You can see that its upper screen is a little bit bigger, but its lower screen is probably a tad smaller. And then here it is next to the Switch 2. And you can see right here that, yes, obviously the Switch 2 has a larger screen, but the main screen of this is actually pretty decently sized. And this is the configuration where you'd play a lot of, you know, maybe Android games. You know, you see me playing the Need for Speed game here. It's a touchscreen, and so, you know, you would play it just like you would on your phone, but you have those controllers. And so if the game supports a gamepad, you know, in Android, like this buggy game here, well, then you can use the controllers and it just detects them. You don't have to do anything special, and it just works right out of the box. And so that's probably considered the main configuration for it, right? That traditional kind of Switch look to it, or the Steam Deck kind of look to it. But you've got this screen that is folded up on the back. And the moment that you turn it towards you, it turns on. And this is where things get interesting and also a little bit more complicated. And so you have that second screen there, and you can use it really just like this if you want to. But obviously, what's cool about this device is that it transforms into kind of like a DS or a 3DS. So those controllers hinge and then attach via really strong magnets. And suddenly you now have a device that, again, looks like a 3DS or you know, a Nintendo DS. Being that this is running Android, there are a bunch of emulators that you can get for this. Now, this particular prototype did come with emulators pre-installed on it. I'm not entirely sure how they're going to do that when it actually goes out to customers or not, but for this video, I'm focusing this particular part right here where it's configured like this, running Citra and also Drastic. Those are the Nintendo DS and also the 3DS emulators that I'm mostly playing around with. Right off the bat, I'm going to jump into some 3DS games because it shows definitely how complicated this thing can be. And if you've ever ran a 3DS emulator like on your computer or maybe your phone, you know that normally when these things run, they have to deal with the fact that that handheld originally had 2 screens on it, right? Well, what does it do? Well, it basically, for the most part, it puts those 2 screens either, on top of each other or side by side. And that's how you would normally play these games. They usually work really well. Well, since this has a second screen, obviously you want to get the most out of it. And so you have to do a little bit of configuring here. And so if the 3DS game boots up and they're above each other, you want to go into the settings for the emulator and then go to layout and basically put them side by side. Then what you do is you bring up the software that this comes with to configure the display layout. And I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into this as this goes on. But for right now, just know that you go in here and you choose Fusion as your option. And essentially what that does is it tells that emulator to put the second screen down below. Now, sometimes that's all you need to do. And then this works just as designed because basically both of those screens are touch screens and you can play these games as normal. However, a lot of them actually will be slightly off center or off kilter. And you see that right here where the second screen is actually bleeding in a little bit above there. And you want to obviously just have that down below. That's when you go back into the emulator and you can go into, I believe it's custom layout. And here's where you can literally change everything about those individual screens. It takes a couple seconds and then suddenly you're ready to rock and roll. And then for the most part, these games run really well. Like, I was surprised. I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. It's basically emulating a Nintendo DS or 3DS. Obviously, it doesn't have the 3D aspect that you would get in the real Nintendo handheld. That'd probably be a whole other thing that they'd have to do, which would honestly be pretty cool. But playing the games like this, it feels like a 3DS. It's actually pretty cool. Now, a lot of games worked really well. Now, I didn't obviously play all of them, but I played a handful over the last couple of weeks. And for the most part, a lot of them just launched and worked really well. However, I did run into a couple issues, specifically with Resident Evil on the 3DS. I initially noticed the slowdowns and stutters, and in the upper left-hand corner, it would say that it was compiling shaders. And especially in the beginning levels of this game, it does that a lot. However, I was able to clear that up pretty easily by going into the settings of the emulator and then going down to asynchronous shader compilation and turning that on, and then suddenly the game runs way better. I probably would turn this on for pretty much every 3DS game. I don't know exactly what it's doing here, but it seems to really help with performance. But other games felt just fine. Again, it was like playing on a 3DS. It was pretty cool. And it was the same thing with DS games too. And, DS games are not going to be quite as advanced as 3DS games, obviously. And so everyone that I threw at it just launched and worked just fine. And on that note, it's actually powerful enough to run a game on each screen. This happened completely by accident, actually. I was messing around with it and I had an Android game up above, and then I launched a game down below, and it seemed to run them both. Now, I'm not talented enough to do that. I have no idea how that would actually work, but I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. I mean, I can see developers doing some pretty interesting stuff with that. So what are the technical specs of this? And I'm not going to go into all the details of it because frankly, it probably just bore everyone. But basically, it's a Qualcomm Snapdragon G3 Gen 3 processor here. And like I said, it's 4 nanometer process technology. It looks like it's an 8-core processor. So that seems fairly decent. Again, it's able to run, like PSP games really well too. PlayStation 2 games were running on this. So pretty much everything I kind of threw at it. Plus modern day Android games like I said, Need for Speed looked and ran beautiful on it. It has 16 gigabytes of RAM plus 512 gigabytes of storage, and it can take a micro SD card as well. So I was able to pop in my micro SD card in here and get the exact games that I wanted on there. It charges via USB-C, and it has a 5600 milliamp hour battery, which I was getting, I think, probably 2 to 3 hours on it. It really depends on what you're doing, right? And how many screens you've got going on this, and how complex the game is. So just kind of keep that in mind. Those are also Hall effect thumbsticks, as well as tactile micro switch buttons. And check this out. I forgot to mention this in the beginning, but it comes with a removable D-pad, but it uses really strong magnets to do that. So there must be magnets under each of these buttons, and depending on what side you want it on, either the left or right, you can put the D-pad on there and use it, or take it off and never use it. It kind of just leaves it up to you. And because those buttons are micro switches, it's very clicky. So, I'm not a fighting game fan, and I know a lot of people who play fighting games are very particular about their D-pad, so I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be for everybody's taste, but at least it gives you the option. I'd never seen that before. It's pretty cool. The other thing that this thing does, and it's pretty clever, is that depending on how you have it configured, you will always be able to access both the volume controls as well as the power switches. So, if you've got it in kind of the horizontal one where it's just one screen, well, again, you're going to get access to both the controller triggers as well as the power and the volume. And then if you've got it in the other configuration, you always will have access to that. So again, they've kind of thought all this through. As you can imagine, the software that runs this is pretty important, and with the push of a button, it brings it up. And let's run through that really quick. The option you're going to spend most of your time in is under display, and right here you can configure what shows up either in the top screen or the bottom screen, as well as switch between them or combine them using the fusion option. You can also change the aspect ratio, which is important because this thing runs games across, many different systems over several decades. Under performance, you can give it a little bit more boost if you need some better performance in your game. Maybe push it a little bit harder, but at the cost of battery life. Under light is where you can change the color of those LEDs. It's funny because so many of these handhelds do this now, and it's kind of a gimmick, but it's also kind of cool. And because you can configure this so many different ways, it's nice you can come in here into the gamepad option and also tweak it to your liking as well. But I gotta be honest, I didn't have to use this very much because most of the emulators also do this. And so you can do it per emulator if you want, or you can do it on a system-wide basis. And then this option here is where you can get an upgrade to the app, which they actually did several updates to this even while I was reviewing this prototype. So I suspect that they're gonna, be supporting this quite a bit going forward. Now, as far as audio goes, I didn't detect any problems. It goes nice and loud, and it sounds pretty good to my ears.
There's blood coming from the ducts.
I think the only thing you need to consider is that this doesn't include a physical headphone jack. If you want to use headphones, you're going to need to use Bluetooth. Probably not a big deal, today. Most people have Bluetooth headphones, but I just want to mention it. And Paul asked me another thing that I thought was kind of interesting. He was like, well, will it run actual physical games? Can you plug in your DS games or your 3DS games? And sadly, no. But, when he said that, I was like, man, they totally should do that. They should have included, because this thing's big enough, they could have included, a slot for that. I just think that would be really cool if it actually would play your physical games and you didn't have to go through and get a bunch of ROMs or something like that. So yeah, that's definitely a missed opportunity. It would be cool if it did have that option. And then the final thing is, and I was curious about this, and everyone who's played with it has asked me about it. Okay, well, what about those hinges on those controllers? And, are they going to last? And the answer is they seem pretty strong. They're very firm. They don't feel cheap or loose at all. And the nice thing is that when you snap the controls in, whether it's, the horizontal way or the DS way, it's got some strong magnets that snap it in place, and you actually have to pull a little bit to get them to come apart. So they feel very sturdy, but obviously I've only had this for a couple weeks. Once this gets into customers' hands and, months and months down the road, who knows? But I don't see any red flags going forward. I never had a problem with it while I was messing with it.
Yeah, it's those magnets are beefy, I gotta say. And you can pull out a stump with those things. Those are... Yeah, it takes something to pull those out. I'm sure I would snap this thing in half. Just, get it out of there! And rip it off like a turkey leg. But no, that's beefy. It's hefty, too.
It is.
It's got some weight to it.
There's some tech in there for sure.
Yeah.
The final thing you're probably wondering is, okay, this all looks pretty interesting. How much is this thing? Well, take a guess. How much do you think this thing is? Well, it's not cheap in my opinion. It's $600, and that is the early bird discount through their Indiegogo campaign. You know, and I told Rebecca, and she's like, wow, you could buy a PS5 for that, or, you know, Switch or whatever, which is absolutely true. What I would say, though, is that, you know, this is for the person who really does want a good solution for many, many different consoles, right? If you want to play Android games, if you want to play PlayStation 2 games and PSP games or whatever, plus DS and 3DS games, this is kind of a very unique solution to that. But overall, you can tell that actually I enjoyed my time messing around with this thing. I like the fact that they're trying something new and different. And this company has always done that actually in the past. Because like, you know, even previously they had a laptop that had a removable keyboard that then exposed a controller underneath. So I do like how this company tries new things. Because especially when there's so many other companies out there that are just kind of doing the same old, same old. But again, that price of $600 is gonna make several people pause when they buy this. I do think there's obviously a lot of technology in here, you know, 2 screens plus all that extra stuff in there. You know, that stuff costs money, so I'm not completely surprised it's that expensive, but yeah, it's not gonna be for everybody, right? But I will put a link down in the video description to their Indiegogo campaign, and like I mentioned, this company has done these things in the past. And so they've got a history of shipping these, which is very cool. And you can find out more about it there. And as always, guys, I want to thank you for watching my channel. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.